Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the visual group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. We are especially honored to have with us Professor Patricia Uberoi, who will be chairing the lecture, and Dr. Akshaya Tankha, our distinguished guest speaker. It is a privilege to introduce Professor Patricia Uberoi, one of India's most influential sociologists and a pioneering figure in visual sociology. With a permission, I will highlight just one facet of her extensive and distinguished body of work. Over her illustrious career, she has held teaching and research positions at several leading institutions, including the Australian National University, the University of Hong Kong, the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla, the Delhi School of Economics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Institute of Economic Growth, where she also served as co-editor of Contributions to Indian Sociology. Professor Uberoi's foundational engagement with visual culture began in the late 1960s in Shimla, where she and Professor J.P.S. Uberoi developed an enduring interest in the popular calendar art sold in the city's framing picture houses. This early curiosity evolved into an extraordinary archive of images that explored themes of gender, family, sexuality, childhood, modernization, popular religion, and nation building, subjects that became central to her later scholarship. Her landmark exhibition, From Goddess to Pin-Up, Femininity in Indian Calendar Art, transformed the ways sociologists approach everyday visual materials. She later extended her analysis to Bollywood cinema, bringing sharp sociological insight to questions of desire, kinship, transnationalism, and cultural imagination. These contributions, collected in Freedom and Destiny, Gender, Family, and Popular Culture in India, continue to shape scholarship across the humanities and social sciences. This is precisely why Professor Uberoi stands as a foundational figure in India's visual sociology, having shown long before the discipline was formally recognized that visual forms offer crucial insights into the country's social and cultural processes. Her presence as chair today brings both historical depth and intellectual continuity to our conversations, grounding our discussions in the pioneering work that made this field possible. It is in this spirit that the need for visual sociology becomes especially clear today. We live in a world saturated with images, those that document protest and political violence, those circulated through social media that shape identity and aspiration, and those produced algorithmically that quietly regulate visibility, access, and power. Uh, Traditional sociological methods alone cannot capture these shifting terrains. Visual sociology enables us to analyze how images are produced, circulated, consumed, and contested. It provides tools to study lived experience, interrogate representational politics, and engage in participatory forms of research that democratize knowledge making. It also allows us to work with communities whose histories and voices have long been marginalized in textual archives, offering new forms of visibility and recognition. Against this backdrop, it is a particular pleasure to welcome Dr. Akshaya Tankha as today's guest speaker. Dr. Tankha, historian of modern and contemporary South Asian art, is currently assistant professor in the Division of Art History at the University of Washington School of Art, Art History and Design. Dr. Tankha's work exemplifies the kind of critical interdisciplinary thinking that visual sociology urgently needs today, moving beyond surface appearances to situate images within broader histories, struggles, and lived realities. With Professor Uberoi chairing the session and Dr. Tankha guiding us through his research, today's gathering brings together two generations of scholarship that have shaped and continue to shape the field of visual sociology in India. And now, in keeping with the spirit of this session, it is most fitting that Dr. Akshaya Tankha be introduced by our chair, Professor Patricia Uberoi, whose own pioneering work in visual sociology has shaped the very foundations of this field. I warmly invite Professor Uberoi to offer his introduction and chair the session. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Patricia Uberoi and Dr. Akshaya Tankha. Over to you, ma'am. It will be a great if you introduce Akshaya Tankha.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and it's been a greater pleasure and a wonderful surprise to see the institution of visual sociology as a field within sociology of India or sociology per se. I mean, a lot of people think that this is a very trivial interest, something like a hobby, which in some ways it is. And one always faces a sort of credibility gap, uh, especially when you might claim to be doing field work, for instance, which doesn't seem to fit the normal patterns. But I think we all have a lot to learn from each other as well. And I personally am very, very happy to see this development. I'm also very happy to see Professor Akshaya Tankha here, and that you have invited him for this early lecture within your series. I was privileged to hear a paper from him about a month or so ago, delivered to a group in the India International Center. And I was absolutely thrilled and delighted with the presentation. I came to know only subsequently about his academic background, which I think you have alluded to. He'd done philosophy in Delhi University, MA Arts and Aesthetics in JNU, as you know, the School of Arts and Aesthetics, MPhil in Social and Museum Anthropology in Cambridge, and finally a PhD in art history at the University of Toronto. I'm not sure, and he may need to correct me here, but I believe that there he was his supervisor, or anyhow, a very close associate was Professor Kajri Jain. Am I right? Right,
That's
supervisor. Many of you may have read her work. It's absolutely path-breaking for us in India and universally as well. She has two very, very famous books, one based on basically popular prints called Gods in the Bazaar, published by Duke University, and a second one in which is very recently, well, published in 2021, called Gods in the Time of Democracy, in which she was looking at particularly gigantic structures of Hindu gods and goddesses, as these are being instituted newly all over throughout the geographical space of South Asia. And I can really recommend this book as both theoretically sophisticated, very readable in her rather tongue-in-cheek sort of thing, and absolutely, I mean, she predicted, if you like, a lot of things that have now come to being in this country in the last year. But that is something apart. Now, as I said, I had the privilege of hearing Akshay speak, and he was speaking on, indigenous sculpture and buildings in Nagaland, am I right? And particularly, again, gigantic structures and monuments and housing designs and so on, with a great sense of place and people. And politics. I should add politics as well. I've also noticed that he has taken an interest in museums and written on that subject. And I must commend this as something that the anthropologists and sociologists, I mean, the museum as an object of interest, is something that we should all be taking very, very seriously. I myself recall having gone to, I think, a museum of indigenous culture in Shillong, I think, but elsewhere in the Northeast, and being actually very, very troubled by the way in which the artifacts were presented, the language in which they were presented, and so on. I felt that there needed to be really critical eyes on this particular thing. And you won't be dealing with that necessarily at this moment. But I would like to commend that within for the visual sociologists as something, museology, which is something that I think we should all regard as a proper object of critical and discriminating interest. He'd also, and I'm sure this will come into today's talk, taken a parallel interest in the role of tourism in the construction of imagery and self-imagery in the region or anywhere that you care to take as a region or a populace of interest. So I don't want to take any more words from his mouth, except to say that I'm really delighted, and I'm sure many in the audience will be too, that he has found the moment to present a description and a critique of women's labor, artistic and domestic labor in the region and among the people with whom he's dealing. Now, not that many men are writing so sympathetically, I guess, about women's labor, but we look forward to hearing from him, and I'm sure that you will be really delighted with this paper, and I'm sure I will be too. I can hardly wait. So please go ahead, Akshay. It's a delight to have you, and I'm so glad that you've got an audience to listen attentively to what you have to say.
Well, let me begin by saying thank you, Professor Uberoi, for that very generous introduction. You're right to anticipate that I'll be speaking about politics, about image making, certainly about the question of women's labor. And I look forward to your comments and, of course, the rest of the audience as well, your comments, criticisms, feedback. There is in the work that I'm going to present a kind of tangential inquiry into tourism, or at least the practices of image making within the paradigm of or within the tourist economy. But I'd be happy to field questions about my research on museums as well, in particular house museums. Thank you for sharing that with everyone, Patricia. Thank you also to Professor Vaishali Divakar, Professor Sharma, and everyone involved in organizing this ad hoc group from the Indian Sociological Society. I agree with everyone who has highlighted its importance, and I think this is a really wonderful space to share work on the image and the visual across disciplines. And yes, I do think the work of Professor Kajri Jain has been really pivotal and paradigm shifting for all of us. So I think perhaps somewhere down the line, a conversation on Professor Jain's new book or recent book would also be really wonderful. So without wasting any further time, let me now begin. I'll go for about 45 minutes, and then I'm happy to be in conversation with everyone. So, in 1998, just a few years into her job as a historian in the northern Naga district of Tuensang, and at the end of an otherwise normal day, when she had put her two young children to bed, Iris Odio's peaceful night was broken by the sound of a metal pipe meeting flesh, followed by the sound of an adult crying. To her horror and despair, this sequence repeated itself through the night. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time that she had got a vividly intimate sense of the violence meted out by members of the underground, a term loosely used in Nagaland and Naga-inhabited regions to refer to a vast and fragmented network of armed organizations that claim to work for the cause of Naga nationalism, and that were very active in the decade of the 1980s and 90s to those that had fallen afoul of their unwritten rules of conduct. But it was the first time that she had experienced that familiar combination of helplessness and anger since becoming a mother. And as she shared with me, it was the day she began to take her work as an artist seriously. Nagaland, as most of you know, is a state in India's northeast where 87% of the approximately 2 million strong population is indigenous, self-identifying as tribal, and 95% Christian because of the historical presence of American Baptist missions in the erstwhile Naga Hills district since the late 19th century, and of Naga missionaries since the mid-20th century. Until 1997, Nagaland and Naga inhabited regions in the state's vicinity were home to a long-standing trans-regional and transnational armed movement for political autonomy from the Indian state, and an independent Naga nation waged by Naga groups across northeast India and northwestern Myanmar. The armed movement for Naga Lim, or Greater Nagaland, lasted from approximately 1953 to 1997, when Naga nationalist organizations and the Indian Armed Forces signed a ceasefire agreement, which remains the basis of a 10-year stability till today. As meticulously documented by Naga activists and journalists, this decades-long period of violence, upheaval, and displacement has been marked by the adoption of severely draconian measures and extreme force by the Indian Armed Forces exercised on local citizen subjects, including practices such as razing villages, forcibly uprooting and relocating villagers as well. Testimonies from local subjects, painstakingly collected by Naga and non-Naga journalists and activists, highlight that members of the Indian Armed Forces carried out torture, sexual assault, and other forms of intimidation and violence, such as the display often of bullet-ridden corpses of Nagas to force local residents to surrender during operations during that violent period. As many activists have noted, the scale and patterns of these forms of targeted persecutions meet the UN's definition of genocide. Even as its once unified command rapidly splintered into multiple factions from the 1980s onwards, the Naga nationalist movement endured in the face of this extraordinary application of force. Today, locally published pamphlets, photographic calendars, museums in private residences, and memorial monuments built on state and national highways recollect, celebrate, and visibilize the history of this enduring movement in visual, exhibitionary, and monumental forms. For the most part, these accounts tend to privilege the figure of the male soldier, pastor, or leader, remembered and celebrated as a martyr to the cause, often in the image of the male Naga warrior that is central to the image cultures of all Naga tribes. Now, what is often marginalized in this dominant image of the struggle is the equally critical and integral role that women have played in the movement. For instance, their work as political activists in the movement for sovereignty since the 80s, including in organizations such as the Naga Mothers Association, the Naga Women's Union, and alongside the Naga People's Movement for Human Rights, had shifted the expression of Naga political solidarity in the language of rights and justice, as opposed to territoriality and control in the male-dominated world of Naga nationalist organizations. That work remains largely unheralded in public culture. Missing from this image are also stories of everyday struggles experienced by women under conditions of extreme duress, shaped by the Indo-Naga conflict and its impact on domestic life, as again highlighted by the academics, journalists, writers, and activists across Nagaland and Naga inhabited regions, including by Mona Lisa Chankija, Temsula Ao, Ahili Moitra, among many others. As the anthropologist Dolly Kikon notes, what the persistent marginalization foregrounds is the repeated invocation of the discourse of tribal custom by male Naga political actors in Nagaland, and I quote from Kikon's work, to propagate a male hegemonic power and authority in Naga society, even as male centricity is not integral to upholding customary law and culture of the Naga people that Nagas have fought to uphold. My research shows that the structural conditions that characterize the absence of recognition of women as political actors in public life has a parallel in the field of art, where the figure of the male artist occupies center stage. From the work of the famous Anglican missionary turned anthropologist and India's premier surveyor of tribal art, Verrier Elwin onwards, who celebrated the figure of the male warrior as woodcarver in his influential The Art of the Northeast Frontier of India, national and regional surveys of Naga art have largely centered those practitioners as artists who fashion works from media that are traditionally associated with men in Naga society, such as wood, stone, and metal. Relatedly, as I have written about previously, public cultural articulations of the movement for Naga sovereignty also tend to privilege the work of men based on their association with the gendered craft of fashioning stone. So, in the case of memorial monuments built by Naga stonemasons, and in the case of Naga house museums that are curated by male Naga Christian priests, which draw on the cultural form of the morum, a tribal dormitory that is also mostly used by men. Much like the force that the discourse of tribal custom exercises in Naga society, that of tribal craft results in the marginalization of women's work as art and relatedly in the recognition of women as artists. So what I will aim to do in the rest of this presentation is demonstrate that amidst the convergence of the ongoing impact of tribal custom and tribal craft as two converging discourses, Iris Odio's work, who signs off her artworks incidentally with her other name, Iris Yingsen, performs an artistic response to the structural conditions that enable the marginalization of women's work and as art. I will give particular attention to the period 2007 to the present, over which time Odio developed a practice of painting on canvases derived from nettle and cotton textiles, woven by Naga rural women with pigment sourced, excuse me, sourced from locally grown indigo plants, a practice that the artist has adopted as well. I will aim to demonstrate that the artist's painting practice foregrounds the work of craftspersons who are women as professional work involving creativity, skill, novelty, and contemporaneity in spite of its association and relegation to a patriarchally constituted domain of the domestic. I will also show that Odio's work also echoes the gradually unfolding acts of labor, care, and solidarity performed by women in the home, including through work associated with the kitchen, the hearth, the handloom, and the garden, on and via the canvases, in ways that reclaim the realm of the domestic as a critical site and mode of work, in ways that enact what Dolly Kikon, in a different context, refers to as a Naga tribal feminism. And I'll come back to this point. This I will seek to show uh, I will seek to show that it embodies a form of indigeneity that challenges the colonial forms of relationality that, as Sangeeta Dasgupta and Daniel Rycroft have argued, characterizes the Indian state's co-option and disavowal of Adivasi and tribal struggles into a more singular narrative of tribal belonging. I will highlight that Odio's work constitutes a sense of the environment as well, where nature, culture, and labor cannot be thought apart, which performs an eco-critical responsiveness to the ecological romanticism that characterizes the image of Naga culture, and more broadly, the dominant nationalist Indian image of tribal culture as well. And I will aim to show that by actively citing and creating networks across disparate sites and forms of practice that are discursively separated into, on the one hand, the gendered and invisibilized domain of the domestic, and on the other, the domain of fine art, Odio's work performs a transgressive border crossing that underscores the political significance of the aesthetic in the indigenously inhabited and contested borderlands of Northeast India, and in fact, in a comparative capacity across post-colonial and settler colonial contexts of indigeneity as well. I want to now turn to an engagement with the artist's practice through a focus on some of Odio's early works, such as these untitled acrylic on canvas paintings. After growing up in the urban environments of Nagaland's two major cities, Dimapur and Kohima, and in Shillong in the neighboring state of Meghalaya, the artist made these in what might be described as the first phase of her work as an artist after she had moved to the northern Naga district of Tuensang to take up a job as a lecturer in history at the local Sauchang College. Although she never went to art school, Odio always had been fascinated by the art of Van Gogh, Matisse, Michelangelo, among many others, figures she refers to as the masters. Odio used her free time in this early phase of the move to Tuensang to learn from them about such things as how to combine colors, capture and balance light and shadow, and better understand what she referred to as the very process of painting itself. At the time, art was a hobby for her, one that she pursued with interest, though alongside her more urgent and repeated attempts to get posted out of a town she viewed as quote unquote remote, to give her children the opportunity for a better education and access to better medical facilities. After repeatedly failing to secure another posting, Oduo soon began to channel her energies into her art, now working with a sense of urgency to sense and make sense of home and the politically volatile everyday, an example of which I began this talk with, which characterized her life at the time. So, an impressionistic landscape of a thatched hut and a resting dog against the fading light on the left. Close ups of the dried out and preserved cattle heads, often strung up for view on the beams of the house front of a murung in the middle. And subjective portraits of children gazing out of domestic spaces, peering from behind a hunted specimen of the celebrated Asian hornbill on the right. These works reflect the artist striving to comprehend the minutiae of Naga rural life and a sense of home from which he could no longer escape, in formal terms. In contrast to the kinds of state-commissioned artworks displayed in the Nagaland State Museum in Kohima, the Northeast Zonal Cultural Center in Dimapur, or even in national institutions such as the Museum of Mankind in the central Indian city of Bhopal, which conform to the paradigm of the artist as a reproducer or recreator of an ideal or archetypal form, Odio's paintings also stand apart for their interpretive and subjective nature. Rather than reproduce the totalizing gaze authorized by the Indian nationalist discourse of tribal craft, they showcase the artist's engagement with Naga life through a modernist investment in the formal terms of its expression. For instance, through a focus on the play of light and shadow in rural landscapes. As such, albeit marginalized in the dominant narrative of Naga art patronized by the state in India, the fine arts discourse arises via these works as a poetic license of sorts, or a source of liberation for the female Naga artist, a freedom from the burdens of representing a normative ideal of craft or culture. Gradually, over this tumultuous time period, Iris Odio also became more attuned to the distance between the work of the masters she so admired and the realities of Twinsang as she experienced and encountered them. Rather than turn away from the ugly uncertainties of daily life in a conflict zone marked by the presence of armed state and non-state actors, she began, as she explained, to start painting not out of happiness, but rather out of anxiety, affected by the conflict, which changes you as a person and as an artist. This is reflected in the central figure in both these works, both entangled or bound in a web of constraints that was, in a sense, reflective of the violence that shaped everyday life in the 1990s and early 2000s in the region. Here, the form of the web evokes the still familiar image of concertina or barbed wire fences, highly ubiquitous markers of regimental bases associated with the Indian Army, as well as armed Naga nationalist factions that abound in or near Naga towns and villages. In the works, Odio reflects on the tense nature of everyday Naga realities of the time with a broader temporal arc in mind, which included what she recalled as the transformations in Naga society affected by colonial rule, the coming of Christianity, and the scale of the change these forces caused in local ways of life. Through the works, the artist seeks to challenge the simplicity or straightforwardness of the idea and the image embodied by the phrase, quote unquote, from darkness to light, part of the regionally celebrated evangelical narrative of the spread of Christianity. Through the figure of the bound body in these works, as such, a constrained Naga body politic, caught in an unending spiral of constraints, the artist conveys the complexities, difficulties, and displacements that change over this long arc of time caused as well. This period of artistic creativity was also a time Odio began to research the history of Naga art. In 2014, while working as a lecturer in Sauchang College, Odio completed a PhD from the Department of History and Archaeology of Nagaland University in Kohima. In her doctoral dissertation titled A Study of Naga Artisans and Their Crafts, Continuity and Change, Odio undertakes a comparative analysis of historical and contemporary artisanal practice, including metallurgy, basketry, pottery, and textile work across rural and urban Naga contexts. Based on fieldwork conducted in villages in the district of Tuensang, Noklak, and Kohima, Odio's research highlights the contrasting realities of historical and contemporary Naga artisanal patronage. The thesis shows that rural artisans, albeit celebrated for their specialized skills by their village, clan, and kin-based communities in the past, today struggle to make ends meet, a pattern of decline in craft patronage that resonates with other parts of India as well. Through participant observation, object analysis, interviews to track the life histories of living artisans, and paying particular attention to their struggles, Odio's research foregrounds the detrimental effects that the institutionalized discourse of craft promoted by such organizations as the Nagaland Handloom and Handicraft Development Corporation and the Northeast Zonal Cultural Center has had on the work of rural artisans. Their advocacy against experimentation, insistence on the reproduction of a static ideal of the craft object, and low compensation, the historian argues, has stifled creativity and discouraged artisans from pursuing their crafts. Broadly considered, Odio's thesis highlights the disabling status quo effected by the discourse of craft, reflected in work by Peter Greenough, among other scholars in other parts of the country. Additionally, Odio tracks the innovativeness, ingenuity, and entrepreneurial spirit of Naga craftspersons, women and men, despite these discursive and institutional hurdles they face, alongside economic constraints. Given that artisanal practice is often a secondary pursuit for most of them, which they support through their primary profession as subsistence farmers. Notably, Odio's research casts a light on the struggles rural artisans, who are women, have often silently endured, working under and amidst the conditions of violence created by armed conflict and its collateral effects on families and households, namely the loss of male family members who became casualties of armed conflict, heightened drug and alcohol abuse, which was acute during the 80s and 90s, and instances of domestic violence. Odio realized that many of the rural women weavers she interviewed were widows, partners of deceased men who had perished due to the overlapping webs of violence regional subjects have found themselves caught within since the past many decades. That is how, and I'm quoting from Odio, that is how I started to understand the plight of women in the village, Odio recollected, something she folded back into her practice as an artist as well. Completed in 2014 in rich shades of blue, red, brown, and grey, Odio painted this figure of the rural female weaver at a time when her research had exposed her to this unspoken reality of the conflict. And I would state that it responds to the conflict in two equally significant ways. Firstly, as an image, it shows a woman dressed in an embroidered top and mekhala or wraparound skirt, seated before a traditional backstrap shuttle loom, executing a hand-woven textile associated with the Kyamungang Naga community. And you can see the form of the textile in the middle, where in the image itself, the portion that is the woven textile is the canvas laid bare without the application of paint. That the figure is turned away from the viewer conveys the idea that the domain of women's work, carried out mostly in the confined and out-of-sight domestic spaces where the traditional backstrap shuttle loom is placed in Naga village homes, is hidden from public recognition as work. Relatedly, the body of the weaver at work also challenges the highly visible, sexualized image of the smiling tribal woman, popularized in anthropological monographs by colonial administrator anthropologists like Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf in The Naked Nagas. This is in the context of Nagaland, and echoed in the work of artists and photographers such as Jamini Roy and Sunil Jana, among others, who celebrated the figure of the Adivasi, that is, the Santhal woman, in work associated with the nationalist modernist movement that unfolded in Shantiniketan over the early to mid 20th century. Art historians write about Jamini Roy and others from the pre-independence period as performing a quote-unquote political primitivism that identified folk, popular, and tribal art as an authentic expression of the Indian soul, and as such, a significant modernist act of disidentification with colonial power. However, in hindsight, it is possible to consider that this political primitivism failed to challenge the discourse of primitivism per se, nor the caste, class, uh, and gender hierarchies it consolidated between the figure of the artist and their muse in the colony or the post-colony. In contrast, Odio's work both underscores the primitivism of the dominant image of the passive tribal woman, and it challenges it with an image of an active and laboring body of the rural weaver. In the process, her focus on a simple scene of weaving also intervenes in the dominant and exclusively male-centric image of the creator of quote-unquote tribal culture that has been popularized in colonial and post-independence surveys of Naga art, making plainly visible what patriarchy otherwise marginalizes from view. The second way this artwork surfaces as significant in the artist's body of work is signaled by Odio's turn to a hand-woven textile as canvas, also apparent in later works such as this. Odio's turn to hand-woven textile canvases began partly out of necessity. The sparsely developed roadway infrastructure across the mountainous topography of Nagaland, which is difficult to maintain due to the region's year-round monsoonal climate, means that it takes an average of 9 to 12 hours to reach Tuensang town from the state's prominent urban centers, Kohima and Dimapur, and it can be as much as 16 to 18 hours. So the relative inaccessibility of her location from places where she could obtain a regular and ongoing supply of art materials, including canvases and pigments, had a significant role to play in her willingness to experiment with hand-woven textiles. Odio started this experiment by trying out cotton-woven textiles as a canvas that provided a familiar white base for her paintings. At first, this shift caused her considerable challenges. As she shared with me, in the beginning, I was using watercolor on the traditional material as canvas. But on textiles, watercolor-based work doesn't show much. So the best thing to do was to use indigo-derived pigment. Gradually, as the artist gained a greater facility with working with the natural fibers present in a hand-woven textile, she began to prefer the beige-hued nettle fiber woven textile over cotton and pigment derived from indigo. As Odio has explained to me, creating textiles out of the natural nettle plant is a complex process that is carried out by women in Kyamungan Naga villages such as Choklangan, Wei, and Noklak across the districts of Tuensang and Noklak. It begins in the winter months when women weavers are not required to farm their fields and involves several stages of soaking, cooking, drying, and spinning to extract the fiber of the plant. The process of deriving pigment from plants from which indigo dyes are derived, which Odio used to make these works, is also similarly arduous and gradual, involving multiple stages of soaking, fermentation, drying, and mixing. And I'm not going into the details of the process since that is a part of the artist's process of work. Although it is simple to understand the logistical constraints, led Odio to turn to hand-woven textiles as an alternative to conventional canvases. The slow and cumbersome process of transforming the nettle plant first into fiber and then into woven fabric upon reflection doesn't appear to be a practical substitute either. Similarly, deriving pigment from leaves is subject to the whims of nature as well, dependent as the process is on the presence of adequate moisture, dryness, heat, and shade at different stages of the transformation and extraction process. For an artist operating in a geographical context where sourcing and establishing a regular supply of art materials is a perennial struggle and never assured, this was a less than efficient or stable option to fall back on. As such, what I'm trying to highlight is is that it's important to note that the artist's choice is a political one, a willing submission and participation in a slower pace of work that resonates with and is in solidarity with the temporality of the professional work of weaving and the temporality of grieving, that is, overcoming the odds and enduring that characterizes the life of the women weavers with whom the artist had become acquainted during this process of practice and research. Her artistic practice goes hand in hand with forging ties with women weavers as well. For the last 15 years, Odeo has almost exclusively bought cotton and nettle woven textile canvases from a weaver by the name of Tokpon, a weaver who resides in the Noklak village. She has endorsed Tokpan's own creative practice too, which includes weaving shawls, mekhalas or wraparound skirts, and bags by recommending her work to the buyers of her own artworks. Through the artist's efforts, Tokpan's work and that of other Naga women weavers from the districts of Tuensang and Noklak have been recognized by international curators as well. For example, the weaver's work was purchased by the curators of the Stiftung Humboldt Forum in the Berlin Palace in 2018. In 2022, Odeo participated in an exhibition curated by a team that included the artist based in Nagaland, Zubeni Lotha, in an exhibition titled Nagaland, Voices from Northeast India, which was originally held at the Humboldt Forum in Berlin over 2022 to 23, though it has been extended to the present time as well. In fact, it's going to be on for much of 2026 too. For the accompanying catalogue, Odeo also authored an essay titled In and Outside the Museums, Reflections of an Art Historian. In the essay, the historian and artist writes that viewing Naga artifacts in German archives, which she began visiting in 2018, reminded me of the many women back home who had woven textiles to fend off hunger and inhumane torture meted out to them by the Naga insurgents and the Indian army, survived sexual abuse and domestic violence. With a simple backstrap loom, Naga women still preserve and create exquisite textiles, thus crafting resilience to build a better future. End quote. Odeo honors and extends this resilience through her public-facing scholarship, in which she connects a discussion of the archival object with her field-based insights into the work of contemporary weavers of textiles and baskets. In this regard, she continues to share her archival research with members of the crafts community in Nagaland as well. In a conversation earlier this year, she recalled that visiting the archives reminded her that, and I quote, "there is so much more research to be done. So now I am interested in carrying out that research with members of the community to better understand the art of basketry, where they get their materials from, when those objects might have been made, making the collections accessible to the craftspeople as well." Odeo's expression of ties with women's work surfaces in the recent creative turns that have characterized Odeo's practice as well. For instance, in this unfinished work I had the privilege of seeing in 2022, Odeo forgoes the use of pigment on the textile canvas altogether, instead opting to reproduce the Naga body, which has appeared in her artistic practice in various guises over the years, this time by unweaving some of the threads in a manner that creates positive space out of an otherwise blank woven canvas. Odeo described this use of applique work to create the then in-progress composition as an homage to rural women weavers and their more recent creative experiments shaped by the market for hand-woven commodity textiles. In particular, she was referring to her admiration for the turn weavers from Noklak had taken to emulating the addition of fringes or tassels that have traditionally been associated exclusively with male warrior shawls on a range of commodified textile products such as bags and skirts. As the artist elaborated, I found that experimentation very interesting. So I thought, why not try that on my canvases as well? A gesture that highlights the ever-layering nature of Odeo's enactment of solidarity with women weavers in formalist terms. Additionally, the artist's citation of a seemingly minor creative act of repurposing an element of design recognizes also the transgressive value of the weaver's creativity as well, given that its adaptation crosses the borders that discursively separate the reified domain of men's work, including hunting and warring, through which the figure of the male warrior has been recounted in folklore to earn the honor and privilege of wearing a male warrior shawl from the invisibilized domain of women's work. Moreover, the artist uses this formal gesture to refashion a figure that recurs in her own practice, the burdened Naga body, and in doing so offers perhaps a more equal and equitable alternative to the male-centric normative image of Naga culture embodied by the laboring male body. Her cited references to the work of women weavers and the creative turns in their professional endeavors also underscores the contemporaneity of weaving and of women's craft as such, alongside her own practice as an artist. I want to now take a little time to reflect on the political significance of Iris Odio's artistic practice, which supplements the role the artist has actively played as a regional citizen subject by supporting the growth of independent journalism, playing a part in regional demands for gender justice, and participating in church-based efforts to address the effects of domestic violence and drug abuse on Naga society. In indigenous pedagogies of love, theorizing non-scalable worlds, Elspeth Iralu and Dolly Kikon draw attention to community-based practices such as Naga storytelling about rice, which are tied to gestures like squeezing rice in a palm or measuring a ratio of rice to water with the knuckles. According to Iralu and Kikon, such gestures may not offer an accurate sense of measurement or the most efficient and reproducible model for cooking rice. But what makes them significant is that they can identify such practices as non-scalable pedagogies that, in contrast to dominant notions of development, index indigenous measurements at the scale of the body as a way of accounting for, remembering, and narrating relations across time. In figural and material ways, Odio's work also reproduces a similarly non-scalable Naga pedagogy of practice, enacting a form of remembering, recognizing, and narrating women's work and its role in the very fabric of Naga social as well as political life. Elsewhere, in an essay on the 2017 agitations led by male political actors and bodies against the institution of reservation for women in Nagaland's Legislative Assembly and tribal councils, in an essay titled Women at Work, Dolly Kikon writes about the agitations as obstacles in the Naga movement for the right to self-determination. Here, Kikon highlights the importance of raising public awareness about the fact that, and I quote from the essay, the labor of Naga women that goes into feeding the family, preparing a feast, or the routine sessions of serving, or of working in the paddy fields, markets, public offices, and the professional world of research, engineering, business, and media are all equal forms of work. Raising such awareness in the regional context, Kikon argues, is key to challenge the patriarchal construction and marginalization of the domestic world as an extension of tribal femininity, instead reanimating it as a space where new political debates about sexual violence, unemployment, livelihood issues, and emerging forms of masculinities and insecurities in Naga society can take place. I should add that this essay was written in the context of agitations raised against the reservation of women in the Legislative Council and other tribal councils. So just to give you an update on those agitations, in 2023, in November, the Nagaland Legislative Assembly convened a special session where the Nagaland Municipal Bill was passed, which has since ensured the reservation of 1/3 of seats in municipal councils for women. So that's just to give everyone a sense of where those agitations led to, what those agitations led to. Now, in the light of Kikon's emphasis on the importance of re-engaging the space of the domestic as a space of debate, of equality, of open-endedness, and of gender equality in particular, I want to highlight that through a focus in her work on the labors of professional craftspersons who are women, though which are bracketed with the gendered spaces of the kitchen, the hearth, and the garden as well, and a focus that also unfolds in figural and material ways, Odio's art similarly challenges the dismissal of women's participation in the worlds of professional work or weaving, as well as the very idea of the domestic as marginal, instead highlighting it as a critical site and form of labor. In reclaiming the idea of the domestic as a critical site of labor, Odio's work also enacts, in artistic terms, what Kikon calls a Naga tribal feminism. That is, in her artistically specific ways, Odio's work foregrounds a feminist art that is attentive to the history, community, and ethics of the gender-specific labors of the domestic and its endurance under challenging conditions. As such, Odio's work speaks to the intersections of the infrastructures of art and the infrastructures of craft and labor and feminist practice that is resonant with the kinds of connections between vastly different infrastructures of art making, dissemination, and feminist thought that Karin Zitzowitz writes about in relation to the work of Nalini Malani, Nilima Sheikh, Sheila Gowda, among others, in the wake of India's economic reforms, in Zitzowitz's recent book, Infrastructure and Form, The Global Networks of Indian Contemporary Art, 1991 to 2008. The artist's willing submission to the temporalities of fermentation, decomposition, sedimentation, and the accompanying reconstitution that occurs in the emergence of her principal artistic materials, that is, the woven canvas and the pigment, points to something equally salient as well: the constitution of a sense of the environment that is concertedly political. Let me explain what I mean by that. Writing on the pivotal role that Elwin played in the discursive construction of tribal identity in post-independence India, Archana Prasad characterizes the anthropologist and tribal arts surveyor's work as characterized by an ecological romanticism. Oops. Displays of tribal art in Nagaland actively spatialize this ecological romanticism in various ways. Whether in the Nagaland State Museum, which is full of dioramic tableaus that reproduce the image of the tribal other as a primal subject. So what I'd been sharing was writing on the pivotal role that Verrier Elwin has played in the discursive construction of tribal identity in post-independence India. Archana Prasad characterizes the anthropologist and tribal arts surveyor's work as characterized by an ecological romanticism. Displays of tribal art in Nagaland actively spatialize this ecological romanticism in various ways as well. Whether in the Nagaland State Museum, which is full of dioramic tableaus that reproduce the image of the tribal other as a primal subject of a pristine nature, or in promotions undertaken by the state government for the purpose of increasing regional tourism that publicize rural Nagaland as natural havens for quote-unquote ecotourism. Ironically, this drive to commodify the region's ecology within the terms of environmentalism unfolds amidst a long-standing tussle between the Nagaland state government and the central government of India over who controls the right to mine Nagaland's significant reserves of natural resources, including natural gas, with the former arguing its case as a feature of the tribal autonomies granted to Nagaland under Article 371A, and the latter labeling the state government's claim as quote-unquote ultra vires, or beyond the legal scope of the provision. Among many other examples, this contrast highlights the important role that the production of a passive image of nature, culture, and people plays in the obfuscation of the question of rights and access to resources in the indigenously inhabited Nagaland, among other parts of Northeast India. In the face of this ongoing obfuscation, Odio's work surfaces as an eco-critical art practice that constitutes a sense of the environment where nature, culture, and labor cannot be thought apart, nor disentangled from the questions of justice, equality, equity, and rights. This is an active rather than a passive conception of the nature-culture question as well, attentive as it is to the idea that the care and sustenance of the physical environment is meaningless without a simultaneous concern with an orientation to social and political life. And in so doing, Odio's work enacts a form of indigeneity that while mounting a critique of patriarchy, also challenges the colonial forms of relationality that characterizes the Indian state's co-option and disavowal of Adivasi struggles and tribal struggles into a more singular narrative of quote-unquote tribal belonging. Now, Nagaland is not North America. Nonetheless, the endurance and defiance that characterizes the labors her art actively cites and seeks to reproduce in figural and material ways resonates with what the Michisagig Nishnabeg scholar and artist Leanne Simpson, in the distinctive settler colonial context of indigeneity in North America, highlights as quote unquote resurgence, a form of recollecting histories of loss and dispossession, not as a mourning of loss, but as a way of living in an indigenous present that collapses both the past and the future. There is one additional way that Iris Odio's work is significant, as I see it. Across Kajri Jain's scholarship on calendar art, and more recently, monumental statues of divine and secular figures across India and its diasporas, which explores the interface between the image cultures of Hinduism and media technologies such as chromolithography, photography, cinema, and more recently, concrete. Jain pushes against art history's disciplinary tendency to sublimate the sacred into the secular. That is, Jain identifies the modernist narrative of linear progress and evolutionary succession that is often assumed in the study of modern and contemporary art, such that what was formerly ritualistic has now become art for a secular age, as a problem for the discipline. Specifically, Jain identifies this tendency in art history as an obstacle that prevents an open-ended engagement with religion and with the image as a part of the modern and the contemporary. Based on a study of the contemporaneity of objects or images shaped by the visual cultures of religious and ritual practice in modern and contemporary India, Jain grounds a critique of this tendency in art history by revisiting Walter Benjamin's famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility, and specifically in Benjamin's temporal differentiation between the categories of the iconic or cult value from that of the exhibitionary value of an object, such that the object that formerly held cult value as a ritual object has in the age of modernity acquired exhibitionary value as art. In a challenge to this formulation and separation between the two frames of value and modes of reception, Jain argues that modernity does not render religion obsolete. Rather, the contemporaneity of objects or images shaped by the visual cultures of religious and ritual practice is, the art historian argues, a matter of oscillation, an interaction between religious or ritual as well as exhibitionary modes of reception. That is, it's not either or, but rather it's both. This relationship of oscillation rather than either or, Jain goes on to demonstrate, reveals the changing nature of the image in the ongoing boundary work that it performs in constituting the very categories of religious, secular, and art, both inscribing differences between such frames of value and forming circuits between them. Now, Odio's work does not participate in the image cultures of Hinduism, nor do the practices the artist cites in her art. However, in a distinct though resonant way, Odio's work actively draws connections between the domain of art and the relatively sequestered space of the domestic, such that those associated with weaving, which carry an iconicity tied to other practices such as gardening, the processes included in extracting plant fibers for thread and pigment, as well as oral narratives around them, such as songs and stories about weaving as such. That is, those labors are entangled with these practices and the non-scalable ways in which they are reproduced, remembered, and passed down through generations. As such, the novelty of her practice also highlights the domestic as a critical mode of labor or work. That is, its exhibitionary value as art is grounded in an active and open-ended circuit it creates with what, in comparison, may be framed as the iconic value of women's work tethered to the sequestered space of the home. Here, the specificity of her work as art is anchored to an engagement with and perception of the equally specific nature of the labor, of the craft, of these practices associated with those spaces. That is, their contemporaneity is co-constitutive. One constitutes the contemporaneity of the other. And it is in this transgressive act of crossing the border that discursively divides the domain of women's labor, which is invisibilized in public culture and public articulation, from the recognized domain of work and of art, which is normatively associated with the domain of men. In this transgressive border crossing across these discursively separated spaces, Odio's work, I would argue, points to the political significance of the aesthetic in the ongoing Naga struggles for justice, including gender justice and self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of all of us for an extremely rich paper. I hope we'll have the opportunity to read and study and reflect sometime soon, before too long, because it is incredibly rich in its thematics, in its presentation, in its detail, and in the expectations of the readers or audience's knowledge of the region and the history. But I think it's certainly drawn attention to the themes that you wanted or maybe didn't intend to, but found yourself illustrating, which is the value of not only of women's work and women's household labors, but the potentiality of women's art as representing this from the perspective of women themselves, rather than the object of the male gaze, the state gaze, the nationalist gaze, or the subnationalist gaze of those who want to, who are in charge of image making of the Naga males and women.
Yeah.
Now, there's so much to be said on this, but I think without wasting any longer, we should open it to the floor for questions, observations, discussion, and comparison, I think. So if someone could kindly put up their hand.
Yes, Professor Sharma. We can't hear you.
So you are muted.
Thank you very much for your excellent paper, and particularly mapping, women art and how it reflects upon the existential conditions in Nagaland, and also giving it a kind of historical perspective. Now, it provides us not only from the point of view of paper at this moment, but even from the point of view of our group on visual sociology. Now, it gives us a lot of insights and also widens our horizon that which are the areas in which one can, go, and as far as one can go in exploring visuals. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, you have also made use of a metaphor in the title, The Sound of a Metal Pipe Meeting Flesh. I would like to know from you that how this connects with your entire exposition of women art and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. This was basically a reference to the anecdote that the artist Iris Odio shared with me at the start of our conversations about her work and her practice. And what the significance of the anecdote and this particular phrase in it was to highlight to me that the the everyday sense of violence within which she kind of made sharpened her work as an artist, that was central to her to commencing her work as such, and her turn to handwoven textiles as canvases, and her engagement with the work of women weavers and a range of other craftspersons really was shaped by and responsive to the conditions of the everyday conditions of violence. So my point in making that the title is to recognize the significance of that environment that shaped her initial foray into the work, but also the importantly and enduringly um, uh, respond the nature of solidarity that the her chosen media and materials carries and embodies, and that is what makes her invested in her work as such, and makes her an artist in her own right, as opposed to someone who at the initial point in their career were thinking with the work of, as she put it, the masters, right? So it's not so much to dwell on the anecdote, but to recognize that as formative in, as she put it to me, the day she began to take her work seriously as an artist.
Yeah, I could gather because you were referring to constraints.
Yeah.
That's what the violence and other dimensions of Naga life were there. But just out of curiosity, I wanted specifically to know the use.
Oh, the story.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
that's
the story was simply that she could hear someone being tortured or beaten to extract information, or because they'd fallen afoul of the unwritten codes of conduct that one or another armed faction had instituted in the village. And these were fairly regular occurrences across much of the 80s, 90s, and in fact in the early 2000s too. So this was someone being assaulted.
the army or other.
Well, uh, in this
State.
situation, it wasn't the army. It was probably a Naga nationalist faction in operative in the region. But of course, the violence is by state and non-state actors at that point.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Someone else like to make a comment?
You can also write into the chat if anybody wishes to.
Yeah,
Well,
may,
let me come in with something. Okay,
Yes. Okay.
go ahead.
ma'am, thank you very much for this wonderful presentations the boy has made. I just wanted to know, do you find this presentation as a contrapuntal to the patriarchal art or to the greater narratives what has been already been made, or it is a new emergence of new discovery? It is complementary or supplementary to what we have been seeing the established art. How far would you place it in terms of comparison between the greater narratives of the rebel movements, or does it complement it, or does it supplement it, or is it something different, taking in new directions? How would you place it? Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you for
must
that.
have called. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you for your question. I think that's a really important question, a very interesting one, one that I hadn't thought of quite squarely in those terms. But the elements that will form my response to that question are those that I've been thinking about. So I think it is certainly complementary. And this, I think, is part of, I would say this is part of, I'm reading this in relation to Iris's larger body of work. It is a form of solidarity in articulated by the artist, but I think central and noticeable in her practice as such. It that form of solidarity makes it a kind of complementary to the craft objects and the craft practices from which it takes, which it actively cites. So there's a kind of it's reflective of a complementary mode of working, but also an object that is meant to make one think about the craft object. At the same time, I think there's something novel happening here, which is the artist's own kind of autonomy and creativity, and that newness is not characterized by a sense of rupture from the practices that it draws on, right? So I think there's a way in which that newness actively forms connections with what in relation to it may be referred to as traditional or old or belonging to the past, right? So there's a way in which there is newness without this idea which is central to the discourse of modernity as such, right? That it's ruptured from the old, from the ritual, etc. So, or in other contexts, in some contexts would be religious practice, but in other contexts it would just be the past. So, and that complementarity is something that even my reference to Dolly Kikon's work requires a little bit of explication, which is that in Dolly Kikon's critique of the discourse of tribal custom, it's not so much the equation between men and women within Naga society that is being questioned. It's the weight of the colonially constituted discourse in obscuring the active ways in which men and women in different and complementary ways are working towards the question, as they put it, of Naga sovereignty. And I think that is something that also characterizes Iris Odio's practice, where working with in these capacities is not so much to only to challenge existing artists, but certainly the discourse of tribal craft that privileges certain actors to be visibilized and celebrated as artists. In fact, in some of my other chapters, I look at house museums, which actually have work by Iris Audio hung within them as well. So independent Naga spaces and actors have also supported Iris Audio's work. So there's a way in which it participates in a wider ecology of artistic practice that is shared, but in relation to the comparatively traditional forms that it cites, it is moving away.
Thank you.
Other comments? Yes.
I have a question actually.
Thank
you. Thank you for this talk, and it's an extensive understanding of women's labor, especially in art form. My question is, being a sociologist, I come from a different discipline. So I want to know something about your method and methodology, like when you are talking about the images, the paintings, you cited Iris Audio's work, but have you gone to these women painters? Have you spoken to them? What has been, if there has been any field experience, would you like to share that with us? It's just an understanding because I come from a different discipline. So something about that.
Sorry, Ankita, if I could just clarify your question. You're asking me about having gone to, you mentioned the painters.
The painters, yeah, you were stating about the painters actually, the women laborers, the painters. So have you gone and spoken to them about their context? Like, I want to know something about the method. Like, did you do field work? Did you go to the painters, or was it something that you did, like content analysis of the pictures? And you went to people who have already worked on the paintings and tried to understand that how it is resisting the nationalist framework or the dominant framework.
I see. No, I get the question now. Thank you for that clarification. So let me just clarify a couple of things there. One is that my work is in this research. It's squarely on Iris Odio's artworks, her practice as an artist. So all the works that I showed are artworks made by Iris Odio. Iris Odio is the person who paints on hand-woven textiles. I think maybe what I could, in response to the question, I could share that the work that the artist is drawing on is that of weavers from neighboring villages and neighboring districts as well. So my research for this body of work, and this is drawn from a larger book project called Nagaland and the Art of Indigenous Presence in Postcolonial South Asia, which has 4 chapters. This is one of them. And across those chapters, all the artists and the kinds of objects that I look at have come out of extensive fieldwork. And what I mean by that is these are practices that are not privileged for the most part within the space of the museum or the gallery. So it's come out of my engagement, extensive interviews, and field-based research in Nagaland, predominantly in the districts of Kohima and Mokokchung, and to some degree also research in Dimapur. And so, yes, my work with Iris Odio has come out of extensive conversations, spending a little bit of time in her in her town, in Tuensang town, and in villages around it. She's the one who actually took me to see some of the spaces around the town. I the artist's reference to that being a primary kind of object of research and a primary kind of engagement with weavers as a part of their practice itself. So that's one way I could respond to your question, but you were also asking about method. And so, sorry, Patricia, were you saying something?
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
Okay. About the question of method, as I certainly draw on interviews with artists, but also through fieldwork, spending time in the region. One of the things that I think with very strongly is about the ways in which people talk about art and talk about images more broadly. And that connects for me as an art historian with post-colonial methods of engagements with the image as such. So within art history, that looks like something like thinking about an artistic form in relation to the image cultures that it is participating with and amidst. So, for instance, in relation to weaving, what is the kind of the frames of value and the modes of reception with which other woven objects are seen, perceived, engaged with by senses other than simply sight, and what that highlights about the image, both as an object of appreciation or an object to be read, say for instance through being able to read certain icons and symbols, but also how does it animate a piece of a shawl, for instance? For instance, we all know about Naga textiles in some capacity. If we go to a shop or something, I was gifted a shawl by someone, which, then I was asked, where would you keep it? I said, I don't know. Maybe I could hang it on a wall. And someone looked at me a bit aghast, like, why would you hang it on a wall? I said, oh, I could decorate, a chair or a couch with it. They were like, you'd be sitting on this shawl, so that highlights the value of the shawl in its capacity to be worn. It means something, but as an object that simply decorates a living room, that's not really valued. Now, for me, that's important because it draws attention to the value as a kind of efficacy, right? Rather than just an object of appreciation. So that tells me something about the image, and that is important to think with. And in these ways, I draw across other objects and other practices that I look at in relation to wood carving, stonework, and the idea of the house museum, for instance. I draw on these reflections that I'm privileged to be invited to listen to gain an understanding of as critical resources that tell us something about the image, that tells us something about artistic practice, and that grounds the category of art in in a kind of local ecology that's not just animated by the post-Enlightenment discourse of art that is central to the discipline of art history. And that's a kind of method that draws on what is referred to as postcolonial methods of analysis, shaped by a range of art historians of South Asia and others from the 80s, 90s onwards, to which I also try to bring attention to decolonizing methods based on the ways in which the questions of, for instance, caste, of indigeneity, and other forms of structural conditions of power that have marginalized certain kinds of certain spaces, certain constituencies. And so it's through a combination of these that I try to engage with the object and the image that's central to my work, and that leads me to the research that I shared.
So what is striking about this is that you have entered the women's world, because their medium was the woven, the message of the woven cloth, and weaving is a women's medium in that area. I think is that the case, that women are the main weavers?
Yes.
So where do we find there's complete silence? We know that there's a male view of violence, of belonging, of Naga identity, but in what material products or in what way is that represented? It's sort of left unexplored in a way as you become involved in the woman's work, the women's perspective, the woman's life, and the women's domesticity. So how would you now approach a male artist and their work? Is it their genres? And well, I think you were looking at, for instance, sculpture and so on, things of stone. So is there something that is said in another part of your book forthcoming? We seem to be having a lot, Professor Duaka, we seem to be having a lot of trouble with the audio one way and another. I
think he got disconnected. I think there is internet issue from his side.
I see.
So, yeah.
Then let's take some other comments in the hope that he can hear, if not speak.
I think he's out of the meeting itself because
of
the internet. Because of the internet issue at his end. I can't see him in the list. So maybe we can just wait for 2-3 minutes for him to join again.
Well, would anyone else like to make a comment that we can put on record or discuss among ourselves?
Yeah.
So we've had questions about methodology, of access. I mean, very rare that a man can have that sort of inner view of a woman's domesticity, and a woman who is not only a wife, a domestic, a mother, but is also an artist of national renown, international renown. Yeah.
True.
Would anyone else like to come in on that?
I'll just check with him in between. So
right. Well, let me throw out another question. I mean, some of the circumstances, the external circumstances of this artistic production are something that people in Punjab would be very familiar with over recent decades. That is violence, internecine violence, state violence, and the struggle for artistic expression. Would anyone like to come in on that?
Hello, ma'am. My name is Ankita. So it's a privilege sharing this platform with you because from a long time I have been reading your work, especially calendar art during my PhD. The question is not about that, but especially as a person working on contemporary media platform, I have seen a certain shift. For example, if you look at the CAA and NRC work, the way you understand violence, the presence of women, the affective intensities and positive emotions. So recently, I am seeing, especially while working on new media platforms, especially digital media, social media, the voices of women who are coming out, especially with the coming of Me Too. I know Me Too has been a very limited and restricted form of feminist movement or women who are talking about their stories because there's a class and caste biasness over there. But slowly, I'm seeing that how on new media, the understanding of violence and lived experiences of women are broadening based on some of the recent movements. For example, the participation of women during farmers' movement, the anti-CAA and NRC protests, even the restless protests that I've seen. So, any insights from you, ma'am, especially if you could hear something from you?
Well, I hope some other people will come in on that because I think when we all began this lecture, what we were anticipating, what I anticipated, and particularly when it was put into a contrast of regional cultures versus, I think we assumed it was the center or the national government or something like that. And it turned out to be, at least the violent situation was one of internecine violence between different groups among each other. I think that was a slight surprise. I was sort of wondering whether from a perspective in a region which has also undergone various movements, you've just described one of them, that was the farmers and the locals vis-a-vis the central government. But in other cases, I mean, how and where would you look for women's voices in this? In literature, in poetry, in novels or short stories or artistic production or craft production. I mean, so many of these crafts, particularly weaving, are in many parts of India all women's work and of great pride and material and spiritual significance. So would people locally like to reflect on that?
Sorry for
Akshay is back.
yeah, sorry about the connection.
Are you in the hills?
I'm not actually. I don't know why this connection went, but we had to reload the router and now I'm back. Yeah. Sorry, I do.
Please go ahead. I was just asking that the Punjab region has experienced a lot of violence, and there is an idiom of the state versus the local sensibilities. There are internecine problems between different groups, and there has been a great deal of violence. Where do women, where would one look for women's expressions in this? One of the answers just given to me was that in the farmers' movement, there was incredible support from women farmers and from wives and so on of people who were actively involved in the movement. But that, of course, is assuming that the problem, and I assumed this from the start, that it was between local and regional sensibilities and the central state. But actually, the violence with which you started was internecine.
Yeah.
And that came as something of a surprise. It was not part of the image or expectation, if you like, that one came with. So I'd invited people from the northwest region, where many of the audience are coming from, to reflect on this and tell me what they think.
Yeah.
Ma'am, could I speak?
Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much for this question. I have done some novels on Kashmir because
Okay.
my question was, what was really the process of estrangement? Was it really a political question or it was a cultural question? Why it is all happening? But what I found finally, I thought it was women estrangement, women's curse rather than anything political or anything different wise. So I think that blending moral space which Kashmir had, it was because of women. Women's role in Kashmiri history right from the beginning. And when we have lost that moral space, that blending space, it was because we have been unjust women. Made be Laladat, right from Laladat, which gave us Kashmiri language, Kashmiri origins, or then in 16th century with the estrangement of Haba Khatun, which where a queen was banished and the Mughals took over Kashmir, non-native kingdoms happened. And since then, I think that representation is now being acknowledged, that Kashmiri poetry done by women, and now people understand that the Kashmiri language was given by Allah, the Kashmiri women saint. And its estrangement is by Haba Khatun's verses, pathetic verses, that moved from in an oral tradition, from generation to generation. Perhaps that was the reason for the cultural estrangement. And now even we say, if Kashmir is to be set right, it is to overcome that cultural estrangement of women especially. And we have to be fair to the women. And that representation is now taking place in a contested way. Of course, it's not a fractured representations all over the in all the literatures, but those who take that moral consensus basis for this estrangement or for this cultural innovations, they think that it is because women representations are less representative, and we have to work on that, and that might give us a new dimensions about the political or a social problems what we have, the turmoil and the violence in this world. And I think that that gives us a new Nundareshi or a Laldar culture, the blending moral spaces, which is perhaps, it is not a syncretic, it is not a composite culture, but these are moral blending spaces which perhaps have been ignored so far. Thank you, ma'am. I have just to speak about it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting intervention. There are some questions in the chat box. Akshay, are you able to?
Yes, I can read it. I can read it out to everyone too.
Yes.
The question is from Surekha Bharti, and it says that I mentioned state patronage about artists, that they would like me to elaborate on how do artists. I guess I'm assuming you're asking about state patronage and how artists respond to the question of patronage. Yes, so that is certainly an important question for most artists operating in Nagaland. The state has been, until very recently, the biggest patron. So there are cultural organizations such as the Northeast Zonal Cultural Center. Zonal cultural centers are all across India, but the Northeast Zonal Cultural Centers are an important space for artists to get grants, fellowships, and spaces to exhibit their work as well. That's in Dimapur, which is in Nagaland, but on the border with Assam in the plains. The Nagaland, the Department of Culture also offers various grants and fellowships. And of course, the Nagaland Handicraft and Handloom Corporation um, offers various regional chapters spread across the districts that provides patronage for artists. But alongside these spaces, what is really important and for me, what was most fascinating was that the village itself, as an artist, for instance, were to come of age, it's at least until the mid to late 20th century, it was the local morung, which is the indigenous dormitory, the predominantly, exclusively, or not exclusively, but predominantly for men, where you would have children who would learn skills in wood carving, basket work, and these are spaces that often double up for both boys and girls. During particular festivals, you practice these traditional craft forms. And so an interest, not patronage, but certainly interest, is shaped by within local villages. And then as you come of age, historically you would have started working as a craftsperson. But many of the artists I have interviewed for my research, who are now in their late 50s, early 60s, they started going to art school, right? They were part of the community that was into making work, and they had a facility and a skill with crafting material of various forms. Uh, their route was to go to art school, whether to the JJ School of Art in Bombay or the Imphal Art College in the neighboring state of Assam. So patronage really comes in different guises. The question, I suppose, that you raised was also in relation to Iris Odio's work on her own historical research on craft patronage and its decline. That is something that craftspersons have depended on historically as a matter of survival to be able to carry on with forms of craft that operates at a very local level, largely to sell products to at the level of the village economy, sometimes in neighboring towns, and very occasionally, if you are very successful, then to the big towns and cities like Kohima or Dimapur. And that is in a state of decline, not unlike the way it is in a state of decline in other parts of the country, and has been for a few decades. So there is patronage to sustain your work to some capacity, but really it is akin to subsistence farming. It has to be supplemented with something else, and so that remains an ongoing struggle. And artists like Iris Audio have access to networks like, of contemporary art at the national level of the region, the nation, and of course the globe. That is not available to craftspersons to that degree.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there other questions in the chat box?
Not that I can see others. No.
No, there is only. I think Surekha is doing very good work on Lavani workers and Lavani performers. So I think her
I see.
question comes from that
I see.
space. So
Patricia, you were asking a question when my connection went. So I wonder if
I don't know anymore, but I was going to say that, well, we are talking within the framework of the visual arts,
yes.
but would you like to expand? What about women writers? What about poets? What about novelists? Other forms of creative work apart from crafts
Yes.
and the fine art, if you like.
Right.
Say what you think.
So actually, in relation to the history of marginalization within the field of art, um, uh, in in comparison to the marginalization in the field of art, actually, women have been central to writing about Naga history and politics, and particularly the history of the movement for Naga sovereignty. They've been integral kind of historians of that movement and activists documenting atrocities at every stage ever since from the mid 20th century onwards. So particularly from the 80s onwards, there's been a kind of very, very healthy and expanding space of literature led by women. And in fact, journalism, the start of independent critical journalism, has also been heralded by figures like Mona Lisa Chankija. So as writers, women in Nagaland and Naga inhabited regions have been a critical force for a very long while. And so, there are regionally, there are new publishing houses that have come up in the last decade and a half. Heritage Publishing House is one such group. There are bookstores run by the publishing houses as well that have been patronizing the work of local historians. Poetry is very rich, much as it like it is in other neighboring states such as Meghalaya, where Khasi poetry has a long tradition. Across many Naga languages, particularly Angami and Ao Naga, there is a very strong tradition of poetry. And of course, prose has been a key kind of face of literature as well, key genre of literature. I think in part the robust environment of local literature is because of the desire and the need to maintain that history, to remember and not let forget the extensive atrocities and of course the struggles endured by regional subjects from you know from the early 50s onwards, when the movement turned into an armed movement against the Indian Army. And so that I think is one of the motivating factors here. And into that space, from the 80s onwards, women have been central to. So in that, those are the scholars I also have turned to in order to think about this research and this chapter in particular. So the work of Temsola Ao, the work of Mona Lisa Chankija, Easterlin Kire is a very big Naga writer who's a poet and short story writer, has written novels as well that have been taught in the Nagaland State University as well. And of course, these writers like Easterlin Kire has also supported the growth of budding writers in Nagaland and across the Naga diaspora. So there's actually a very intricate way in which the literary landscape has been able to sustain itself through local forms of patronage and also spaces of readership. So the bookstores, reading groups, and what I found remarkable was you can go into even 10 years ago you could go into local shops that are run primarily as spaces where you photocopy or Xerox material, but there'll be a dedicated section where most of the local writers are you can buy their book because it's locally published and it's not so expensive. So and that also reflects the high rate of literacy or relatively high rate of literacy in the region.
Well, thank you very much for that explanation. Now, are there any other questions that people would like to put out? Or should I just put in another one myself, where one is not, you've emphasized, if you like, the spiritual aspect of Iris's work, but it is not, it's ecologically spiritual, it seems, as you describe it, rather than what one might imagine to be Hindu or tribal religion. And in this region, there's such a large proportion of the population, and her name would seem to indicate that many of them are Christian. So
Yes.
does the there is a sort of portfolio of Christian feminist imagery, if you like, for taking up. Do you find this a relative, something worth thinking about, or is it not? Are you really interested in the Naga tribal and sub-tribal sort of cultures and their gender dimensions, or are there spiritual dimensions of a different sort?
That's a very important question, which I should consider. I'm actually to to respond to your question. I'm interested in where the object takes me. So, there is a Christian dimension to the work of a number of artists. That is so in the work of male artists who work with wood in the memorial monuments. There is both in both these capacities, Christianity and Christian icons play a role in the work itself, but also in the ways in which artists reflect on the work. For Iris too, the idea of from darkness to light is something that she is actively thinking with. In relation to the craft practices, including of weaving, I wouldn't categorize that as religious or ritual. What I highlighted towards the end of my presentation, in terms of my analysis of Iris's work in relation to Kajri Jain's work, was to highlight the iconicity of the practices, where weaving cannot be thought apart from the stories around weaving or the coming together of women around practices like gardening. That is also part of weaving, because the extraction process involves tending to the garden in order to extract the plant fiber or the leaves for making pigment, etc. So that iconicity is not has a value akin to, but it's not part of religious practice today, because populations are almost entirely Christian. But those stories and the adherence to certain regard towards the woven object certainly reflects its efficacy that extends beyond its appreciation just as a kind of ornamental form. And so, in relation to this work, my attention hasn't been turned to the reproduction of Christian icons or of other forms of local religious practices into woven practice. But it certainly is there. There are more celebrated instances of Naga textiles from districts like Mokokchung, where the application of certain icons is reflective of our Naga practices. Now, what I can share, and perhaps in squarely in response to the specificity of your question, is that Iris Audio does not paint the icons associated with the textiles that she draws from the communities she draws them from. So, for instance, within Kyamungan Naga communities, there are a range of patterns used on textiles, but she very consciously stays away from reproducing those patterns, because within the region, I think she's very carefully attuned to not appropriating, as she has told me, the icons particular to those communities of which she is not a part. So her work as an artist, especially because of her investment in expressing solidarity and supporting the work, is to draw on the fabric and use it to paint, but not to reproduce, because icons are related to particular communities, and often that can result in kind of issues, tensions, the borrowing or the replication of particular icon without approval is an ethical problem for the artist.
It's a very interesting response. So time is flying, I might say. So would anyone else are there any other questions that people would like to ask?
Well, I'm exhausted.
So Professor Duaka, we've had a very, very rich presentation.
Yeah, true.
I think if this is a chapter or a quarter of a forthcoming book, We would like to know much more about it, and which are the three companion papers that sustain this book. We have also been reminded of many authors, or some authors, whose work on gender issues in Nagaland has been very important. He mentioned someone called Dolly Keekon, if
Yes.
people are familiar with her work, an extraordinary writer with a sensitivity, with a great sensitivity to gender issues, to violence, to political questions, and so on. So I think probably all of us have a great deal to learn, not about a region with which we're still reading early 20th century works on that, rather than bringing ourselves up to date, perhaps. I mean, the classics of mid 20th century. And we have a lot to learn. And thank you very much for taking us down that track. And also to Visual Sociology for hosting this. I think it's a very rich event, rich work, and provides us with a set of new perspectives, including that of women's creativity, media, and so on. So I think we can all take a great deal away from this lecture. And I personally would like to thank the speaker for coming in and giving us a preview of something which will soon hit the stands. And to Professor Duwaka for organizing this as well. Thank you so much.
And I must thank Professor Patricia Uberoi for suggesting his name and his work, because otherwise we wouldn't have done this. So thank you so much, ma'am, for suggesting.
Yes, I think we should look at Professor Kajri Jain as a possibility. After all, he has roots in Delhi, and she's extremely productive, always onto new things. Very hard to understand and follow, I might say, but very, very rich when she tells her story.
True.
So we could think of that, particularly this latest work, or even with some member of the group who would like to present a critique of her latest book on the gods in the time of democracy, because it's absolutely relevant to what is going on in the country right now, but from a visual sociological point of view, which most people don't have. I mean, the normal perspective is purely political. And let us see the politics of visuality, or the visual politics as well. So that was just a suggestion. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. So many people attended, and I feel honored to have been here on the platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vaishali, and thank you, Patricia. This has been really wonderful and wonderfully stimulating for me as well. And I'd be happy to share the names of people and a couple of the article length essays. I mean, article length research that has been published from my book project. So be happy to share work on the museums and the monuments.
Yeah, as I said at the very beginning, I think the museum, the visuality of the museum is very important topic for sociologists and anthropologists. And right before our eyes, new museums are being created, and old ideas of appropriate materials are being ditched. And I think we need to, the whole idea of museology is very important. And from a visual sociology point of view, there we have an agenda to which we could add the gender dimension, as you have done for us right here. So thank you a lot. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And back to Professor Duwaka to close.
Yeah. Ankita, would you like to?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank. So I would wrap up the session. Thank you for the productive session. I also thank Professor Vaishali to give me the platform to do the wrapping up. And it was an honor to share the platform with Professor Patricia Uberoi. So just I'll take just 1 minute. So to wrap it up, I'll just say that the material reality of craft and weaving in the lived experiences of the women artists in Nagaland, inhabiting and negotiating various spaces of domesticity, labor, nationalist engagement is explored, especially in this paper. I would like to read a lot of the work of Dr. Akshaya Tankha. So we can conclude this session here. Please feel free to reach out to Visual Sociology Adhoc Group if you need any further clarification. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Professor Sharma, would you like to comment on something? Or
After listening Professor Akshay and Professor Patricia, I think a lot is there to learn first and then to speak. And but certainly Akshay's presentation also reminds us of the role of women artists in the freedom struggle of India, where the poets, poetesses, the theater artists, and the radio artists and others played a very significant role in creating an awareness and creating consciousness of becoming independent and all that. So looking forward to read the book and other works by Professor Akshay. With these words, I would like to thank Professor Akshay and Professor Patricia and Professor Divakar for this wonderful session. I think it will go a long way in supporting our group and its activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
thank you, everyone. Yeah.